Okay, so this is probably going to be one of my more controversial videos, but nonetheless, I'm just going to say this right now as if I don't think it's a controversial statement at all, because frankly I don't. Mass surveillance is a good thing, and the society that we live in should have much more mass surveillance. The UK, I think, famously has quite a lot of mass surveillance, but I would argue we should probably have more, and my utopian society, the society, if I could have like a dream society that, you know, was a utopia, it would have huge amounts of mass surveillance. Every single place that's public, every single public place would be covered by cameras from multiple angles. Every single thing happening in the public would just be recorded, and you'll be able to see it all. So now I'm going to launch into the obvious benefits of mass surveillance and why it is that my perfect utopian society would have mass surveillance. And the obvious answer is because it stops crime. It would so obviously and so clearly stop crime. And sure, you can talk about like the bad crimes, but I think it's just worth for a second considering the fact that there's like lots of small crimes that you could just stop so easily, because I think the issue is these are crimes which it's not worth investigating. These crimes, it's not worth actually getting a detective on it and, you know, doing fingerprints or anything like that. What am I talking about? Littering, dog fouling, probably other things. I guess vandalism. I think, vandalism, sometimes, like graffiti art I think can be cool, but to be honest, no, yeah, like ultimately graffiti art, somewhere you're allowed to graffiti art. So I'm going to say vandalism, because certainly lots of vandalism is not cool. So vandalism. These are crimes which I think by and large, if you see obviously if a policeman sees these things in action, they'll say, wait, stop it. Which isn't that interesting. If a policeman sees these things in action, they'll stop it. But if they just see the after effects of these things, they're just going to go, okay, well, that sucks, that happened, but we can't do anything about it. We're not really going to invest any effort into solving this. Whereas, I want to say this. So first of all, when I see dog mess, as it's called euphemistically here, on the side of the road, or even on the road, I think to myself, that's annoying. Somebody took their dog out, and their dog took a genuine, unironic dump on the road, and this person had a legal obligation to tidy up, and they chose not to do that. Isn't it annoying that they're just not going to be punished for that? Isn't it annoying that our society has rules which basically are rules of like, just be a decent person, clean up after yourself, clean up after your dog, and we're just going to say, actually, you know what, if you break those rules, we're just not going to care about it. And if anything, like, isn't that just unfair to the people who actually do obey the rules? That we have all these rules and we don't enforce them? Why? Because it's too much effort to enforce them? But, I also want to say littering especially. Like, the amount of times I just see, like, I walk along, I live in a nice place, decent place, lots of greenery is how I would define what makes where I live nice. It's nice, but I should also clarify, I live in an urban area, like, well, suburban, whatever. It's lots of green, but also dense population. And with that said, there's so much litter. It doesn't look nice. And it's so kind of strange to even imagine, like, the idea of just walking along and not seeing litter everywhere is inconceivable. It's such a bizarre notion to me to imagine I could just walk along a road and just look in the bush and not see McDonald's cups and whatever else scattered all over the place. By the way, on the subject of vandalism, sometimes people will literally like push over bins and stuff like that. And here's the thing. The policemen, if they, are driving past in their patrol car and they just see a bin that's been pushed over, they say, well, that's the thing that happened. Like, that's what else can they do? What else are they gonna do? Again, if they see it in action, they can stop it. So here's the thing. If we had security cameras in every public place, you could just stop that. Like, you could look, and if you had security cameras in every public place, what can you do? Okay, because think about it, these are mostly teenagers, or I guess horrifying. Well, in the case of the dog fouling, it's probably actually adults sometimes. I was going to say it's kind of crazy to think it might be adults who litter. Like, I feel like if you're like a fully grown person, you should understand that littering is not okay. But whatever. The point is, a lot of these people are just lazy, random people who are only doing it because they know they won't be punished for it. They know that they can get away with it. So with that said, essentially, these people would litter and then go home. Presumably they don't walk out, litter, and then just go home as if that's all they were doing. But ultimately they litter and they walk around in public until they eventually go to a private residence. If that private residence is their residence, they will then stay there. Oh, I failed to put my elbow on my armrest. They will then stay there for some amount of time. Now, here's the thing. If you're a policeman watching security cameras, you can say, oh, that person littered. Let's now navigate through the cameras to follow them to exactly where their house is, show up and say, hey, you littered. We have video evidence of you littering, and we're going to fine you, 500 quid? You can slap down that kind of punishment because you're like, it's so obvious. It's like, we have you littering. And what's the consequence of this? Well, the consequence is pretty obviously that it's not that you're going to have hundreds of people being done for littering and done for all of these crimes. You're just going to have people not do them. If you have a choice between throwing or like carrying your rubbish to put it in an actual bin, or throwing it in the bush or whatever, knowing full well that you are definitely being filmed and they can definitely follow you back to your house, why you're not going to do it, are you? Just not going to commit the crime. And I think that's like a really important thing to just bear in mind. Like, these crimes that I'm describing right now, I don't think people would actually be being punished for them. I don't think you'd actually need to be enforcing the laws against these things, because it would be so obvious that you would get caught. And the other point is that these crimes are crimes of basically inconvenience. So it's not as if it's worth anybody even going to the effort of trying to get away with it. And I'll get into that. Okay, well, I'll get into the whole trying to get away with it as I move on to more serious crimes. Obviously, violent crimes, mugging, sexual assault, murder. The thing about these crimes is obviously, if they're done in a public place, you would presumably be able to see them actually just happen. If these things happen in a public place, you can just see them happen on the camera. You can go, oh, someone was murdered. Let's look at the security camera. There that person is. Let's use the security cameras to follow them to wherever it is they end up going after that. And then we can arrest them. Again, pretty similar logic. Now, there is a caveat here, of course, which is that with these kind of more serious crimes, it's more likely that somebody is going to actually try to find a way to get around it. Obviously, serial killers, for example, Jack the Ripper types, don't do it just because it's, convenient or whatever. This isn't like littering or something like that. They do it because they're actively choosing to do it in a way making life harder for themselves. I can't imagine it's easy to go around murdering people, but I guess they do it because, it's something to do. And within that context, I suppose them trying to find a way around this whole security camera thing is something which they might be like, okay, yeah, I'll give that a shot. Now, I will say that, like, obviously, not every single person who commits a violent crime is a serial killer. Obviously, mugging, for example, well, that's more likely to just be like poor people. I'm not saying like that poor people. I'm just saying like mugging is a crime people do because they need money. I'm not suggesting all poor people mug or something like that. And I guess in theory, a rich person could mug, but it's like, why would a rich person mug? Because they, unless they're like a particularly violent kleptomaniac, which, is possible. But basically, within that context, obviously, crimes like mugging probably less likely to happen, because at the end of the day, you can't just hide, in a bush by the bike, I don't know, in the car park or something, and then just make your attack, because it would be filmed, and then they can just follow you to wherever. Like I say, the same rules apply. Now, obviously, ways to get around it. You could say, oh, destroy the camera. Yeah, but here's the thing: if every single public area is being filmed, then anywhere you could possibly be standing while you're destroying a camera would also be being filmed. So you'd be filmed destroying a camera, and therefore, if you're filmed destroying a camera, and then a murder happens or something like that, or a sexual assault or whatever else, they can say, well, that was probably this person. Like, and also literally, depending on how many cameras you destroy, it's going to be kind of limited. Like if it's like, oh, this person destroyed this many cameras in this many places, and basically we have, like, you would know when it is that person leaves. So it's like you destroy the cameras, you wait for somebody, you attack them one way or another, and then you leave, and it's like, so basically what they see then is the person who you attack walking into the area where you've destroyed all the cameras. Then they don't come out, or, you know, come out, or, you know, I don't know exactly, well, whatever. They get attacked, and the next thing they see is you leaving the area, and then presumably they later see maybe the person making their own way out, or perhaps the person called the police, or perhaps the person can't move, whatever. Point is, you're not getting away with it, are you? That doesn't actually work as a strategy. Now, of course, you could try forcibly dragging somebody away from a public area, but then you'd just be seen doing that. You could also try wearing a disguise, but then the point is, either way, they could follow you where it is you're going. Like, I'm kind of not even assuming the ability to see somebody's face. I'm just assuming if every single public area is filmed, you can trace somebody's movements. You can literally, technically, just trace them to, like, the exact moment you're watching the camera. Even if you're watching something that happened a week ago on a security camera, you can just flick through the things to catch up to where you are now and find exactly that person just by following their movements. But either way, the point is, like, committing a crime becomes so much harder, and you kind of have knowledge that you're not going to get away with it. This isn't a situation where you're like, oh, maybe if I attack this person, I'll get away with it. It's like, no, you know that if you're in a public area, and you know, like public area where obviously no one else is, but you know exactly that you won't get away with it in the instances you won't get away with it. And to be honest, the only real drawback to this, like the only thing I can see somebody say in terms of like refuting the very obvious fact that this will matter-of-factly reduce the amount of crime. Obviously, I mean, it could be the case that you have all the security cameras and then you just don't utilize them. But I'm assuming you have all these security cameras and you utilize them. And you say, no, look, if we find a Kit Kat wrapper on the ground, we're going to look at the security camera to find out who left it there, and we are going to find them, and we are going to find them. Find them and fine them. Fine them £500. And boom, like at that point, like I say, if you make that clear, like it's not just, oh, it's a little thing so we won't bother about it. You say, no, it's against the law. You don't litter. You don't do all of these crimes. We know you did it because we have the security camera footage. You're going to get punished. I don't see how anyone could argue that wouldn't reduce, certainly, like every single crime of, like I say, convenience. Every single crime where it's just people do it because they're lazy and they don't actually care, clearly, about the community they live in, so they're just willing to trash it up. That just stops. Like, there's no logic to like, oh, I need to go litter, but I'm going to do all this elaborate effort to try and get away. No, you just say, no, I'm not going to litter because I know I'm going to get caught. I don't see how anyone could say that wouldn't just stop that crime then. Now, on the subject of like violent crime, really the only drawback ultimately when you get down to it is, would there be enough cameras? Because it's kind of like, okay, in a wooded area, for example, could you have cameras in like the middle of a wood? Would that be difficult? Would that create some environmental concerns that you have to, get the wiring and stuff, or would you have it on battery power? Yeah, it's not quite. Oh, sorry, I meant to mention something else. Sorry, I didn't even mention this. For the violent crime stuff, that you also would have to allow for the fact that policemen might be watching things in real time. Obviously I'm kind of assuming policemen find evidence of a crime or something like that, and then go back to look at the security camera footage to see who was responsible. But there's no reason why a policeman couldn't just be flipping through the cameras in general, in which case, if they do see a crime taking place, then it might be the case that even if you are successfully wearing a disguise, and even if you are successfully able to kind of, let's say, move out of somewhere, maybe go to a public wooded area. I keep saying public. Go to a wooded area, and then maybe you have like a, rucksack where you've got like a secret another disguise as well. So you kind of go out one way, go in one way, go out the other way, and you look different, and therefore they can't actually work out who you are or find out where you went. Well, even if you did all of that, it's possible that a policeman would just be looking through the camera anyway and see the crime being committed and be like, okay, units, head out and stop that person before they even do anything. And of course, actually, it's possible police might even be able to prevent a crime from happening itself. Although I think for violent crimes, how long do they really take? Would a policeman have enough time? Maybe. Anyway, that's just another point I wanted to make. But yeah, the point I'm making is, ultimately, you could say, well, there are some areas where maybe you couldn't have this kind of camera setup, in which case, those are areas where crimes could be committed. So actually, the best argument is just to say, well, no, we couldn't have enough cameras, in which case that's not really an argument against mass surveillance. It's an argument against the fact that, maybe there are limitations to how much mass surveillance you can have. But I do want to address something else. This is maybe more controversial. Here's the thing, okay? In general, I might remember to touch on this a bit later as well. I think the expectation to not be filmed in public is kind of silly. It's sort of like, this is the issue. I don't even have a problem with the idea of everybody being filmed constantly in public space, because you're in a public space. You can't really object to the idea of people watching you in a public space, can you? It just makes no sense. Like, I say, oh, what if I do something embarrassing? I was like, well, sometimes I just look out my window, I see someone do something embarrassing, like nearly trip over, and they don't know it, but I saw it. And it's like, that's just something you have to live with. Oh, what if I pick my nose and then it's on camera and well, either don't pick your nose or just accept the fact that, guess what, if you pick your nose in a situation, it's possible there's somebody you can't see who might actually be watching you. It's like, that's the thing. I don't really understand the expectation that you shouldn't be being watched in public. You are in public. Why do you expect privacy in public? Now, this is where I move on to the kind of controversial thing, which is, I think you could make an argument that we should have security cameras and quite good quality microphones in every single room of every single private house. Now, okay, here's the thing. I want to stress something. I do not think that people should be able to, in real time, watch what everyone's doing in their private house. No. Of course, I think in your private house, you do have a rightful and legitimate expectation of privacy. Unlike in a public place where I don't even understand how you could object to the idea of people mass surveillance and constantly being filmed, in private, of course, you could object to that, especially, obviously in the bedroom, in the toilet, stuff like that. And I do think there should be cameras there. But here's the thing, okay? I think that it should be I think this might be called closed circuit. I know that CCTV stands for closed circuit television. But what I want to stress is that the point is, this isn't going to some place where it's being live streamed or something like that. It just goes to a storage place. Like, basically, wherever it is, the point is people can't access it. And it stores some number of hours of footage from people's houses. And would there be an individual storage thing in everyone's house? I don't know. Would it be like every single street's like connected to a storage place? I'm not sure. But okay, here's the thing. Like I say, this is getting a lot more complicated, and I accept that. But I just want to run with it, at least as a hypothetical, to talk about it. But essentially, this is how it would work. There would need to be an accusation. And essentially what I'm saying is this would stop domestic crimes, and particularly domestic violence, or also sexual assaults. Because of course not all, indeed actually I think proportionally quite a low number of sexual assaults are public space things. But sexual assaults where, for example, you go back to a guy's house and he sexually assaults you. Or of course husbands sexually assaulting their wives, and then of course husbands domestically abusing their wives. Here's the thing. There would need to be an accusation. Somebody, either most likely the wife, or again, if it's actually not in a married couple, the woman, most likely, would say, hey, I'm accusing you, this thing happened. And at this point, you would then say, okay, there's been an accusation, so we are going to look at this footage. It's going to be looked at by, let's say, a professional to actually just check that this isn't a completely nonsense accusation. And then if yes, it is actually, there is a legitimate case here, then say, okay, let's have it looked at by more people. And just, at that point, sure, now you don't have the expectation of privacy. There's this accusation, it's against you. And I do think also with this, you could make a legitimate argument that false accusations should be punished. One of the issues right now is that with the whole punishing false accusations, this is quite a tangent, but I just want to say the issue with punishing false accusations, it's one of those examples, I love these examples, is an example of something which sounds good until you actually think through the implications. I've mentioned this before with lots of other things, but this is one example. By the way, interestingly, mass surveillance is, I would argue, the opposite. It's something which sounds terrible, and I'd say there's a lot of kind of things like this I support. It's something which sounds terrible until you actually think through the implications, like, oh, actually it makes sense, it would be better. But punishing false accusations of sexual assault, I think, is something which sounds good until you actually think about it. Because, of course, the standard argument would be, well, you're undermining actual victims. So, even just from the perspective of being sympathetic to victims, we should be punishing false accusers because they're making the system worse for everyone. And then, of course, you just have the standard like Elizabeth's perjury and all that. But the issue becomes, where do you draw the line between there not being enough evidence of sexual assault and it being a false accusation? If somebody says, oh, I was sexually assaulted, and then you don't find evidence, could that mean you then say, oh, this person falsely accused them? Again, I'm assuming we don't have security cameras for this. This is the key thing. I'm just talking about in general in society, where you wouldn't maybe necessarily expect to find evidence. And at that point, you could see a situation where women don't want to come forward because they're afraid of being arrested or punished for false accusation. If you do you do this thing and then there's a case against you, it's like, okay, so maybe they do find the guy innocent because there's not sufficient evidence, but at what point does it turn around and become, oh, there's not evidence and therefore we say that this person is falsely accusing? What's the question? Of course, there's also the fact of like, people aren't going to come forward, like women would be less likely to come forward and admit they made a false accusation if there's a punishment. So these are all, these are all issues. But here's the thing, okay? Punishing false accusations would work better if you had this security camera thing. Because think about it. If literally, I don't know, this whole thing happens, and, you go home with a guy, let's say you're a woman, you go home with a guy, and then nothing happens, and then you accuse them of sexual assault. If you've got the security cameras at that point, you say, okay, there's an accusation, let's look at the security cameras. Oh, wait, literally nothing happened. I mean, at that point, it's almost like, I suppose you could punish the false accusation for, I guess, basically causing you to invade this guy's privacy. Like, that would be the logic. It's like, well, if you make a false accusation, you are causing somebody's privacy to be invaded so the accusation can be investigated, and that's why you should be punished. Of course, you don't really have to worry about the idea of like, by making a false accusation, you're potentially leading, because right now you have a system where making a false accusation could potentially lead to somebody losing their freedom, because we don't have security cameras that can prove somebody's completely innocent. If we did have those, then there would never be any risk that somebody's going to falsely go to prison. Anyway, so yeah, I just wanted to kind of explain. I mentioned like having microphones. The reason for that is because I think you could be able to, for example, tell exactly, even at like a whispered tone, for example, in the case of an accusation of sexual assault, how much resistance was given. Was there any resistance given? How did the man respond, for example? And I say this because, of course, what exactly constitutes sexual assault can go from full on, like, the woman's proper resisting a lot, but also if the woman's just resisting verbally in a kind of passive way, that's still sexual assault because she's resisting, she's not actually consenting, and even if she's not properly screaming or whatever else, that's not the standard. So that's the point. It would allow you to, like, sexual assault is a very difficult thing to enforce, or rather to punish, because there's, first, it's basically a he said, she said thing, right? You don't really know the evidence, and apart from anything else, even, like, the point I'm making is even if you had, like, photographic evidence, you wouldn't know, like, the conversation that happened. You wouldn't know, like, actually what happened. You wouldn't be able to tell, for example, like, it's possible you wouldn't be able to tell whether or not a woman's conscious or not from a photo, but you'd be more likely to from a microphone, for example. There's so much you'd be able to tell, and it's like, goodness me, wouldn't that be good to just be able to be like, oh, yeah, sexual assault, we can just really have a very good idea of whether or not this actually went down. We can tell, for example, is she slurring her words? Is she really kind of basically being kind of passive in a way where like the guy's just, like a situation where she's drunk and the guy's just like moving her around and she's clearly not actually aware of what's happening. These are all things which it's not necessarily so easy to prove, just based on like, looking back and, doing all of these like kits and stuff. It's things like that. But if you have this, you just say, oh, there's the accusation. Let's look at this video footage. Boom. There it is. That's the crime happening right there. Boom. And obviously with sexual, see, I'm talking about the most complicated thing, but domestic violence, that's even easier. It's like, think about it. A husband slaps his wife. It doesn't leave any evidence at all in reality. Like, a husband anywhere in the world right now could be slapping his wife and getting away with it. But if you have these cameras everywhere, and the wife can just accuse the husband. Obviously, it doesn't avoid the psychological reasons why a woman might not do this, but like at the same time, and this is, I guess, the key thing. It's another situation of, would these crimes even happen? Like, think about this for a second, okay? Would a man actually hit his wife if he literally knows that there will be video evidence of it and all she needs to do is at any point get the courage? I say courage, I don't want to, that almost sound like I was saying like women who don't accuse. Obviously I realize there's lots of complicated psychological stuff going on. I don't want to undermine that. But he knows that if any point the wife does decide to accuse him, the evidence is just going to be right there immediately, unambiguously. What he wouldn't do it, right? Like there's just, and it's sort of like, I mean, dare I actually say that I think, why would you have domestic violence? Like, how would you have domestic violence in a situation where, like, I refuse to believe that it's not true that the main reason men commit domestic violence is because they know they can get away with it. So if they literally knew that they couldn't get away with it, they knew that all it would take is one accusation, and boom, all of the, like evidence of it can be shown on camera. And obviously as there be more and more evidence, you could just say, okay, let's take this right up to the judge, show the judge, hey, look, here's the evidence, pretty unambiguous. Why would anybody do it? They just wouldn't. So it's like, I mean, you want to talk about benefits. How about, like, and ultimately here's the situation, okay? Of course, I can understand like the idea of like privacy, and of course this would actually lead to a situation where people who might legitimately want privacy and have a legitimate claim to privacy might find that they don't have that privacy. As far as I'm concerned, for example, if you commit a crime in your house and you're accused of that crime and you did that crime, then you don't have a legitimate claim to privacy. People can look into your private life to establish whether or not this was true. However, obviously if you're falsely accused, then it's wrong. You should have had a right to privacy. You shouldn't have had, so if you're falsely accused of sexual assault, and as a result of that, people are going to look at some video footage of your naked body, for example, you have a right to feel like, oh, I should have had my privacy, but that's why, because that right was curtailed, not by the actual security camera itself, but by the false accusation. That's why the false accusation could be punished. Point is, in a very obvious sense, in this case, if you don't want anything bad to happen, just don't commit the crime. It's a very obvious, like, there's a very clear one-to-one parallel. It's like, for example, me, here's the thing, if there was a camera everywhere in this room right now, and it was all being stored somewhere safe, of course, and, the safety thing is something which I must admit I'm not, like, the technical aspects of this I'm not totally confident on, I want to be clear on that. But assuming that the technical aspects were all certain, and it was all being stored in a perfectly safe place, why would I have an issue with that? What issue could I have with that? It's like, it's being stored and not being watched by anyone, and the only situation that could happen is, okay, if someone falsely accuses me, oh dear, I do lose that privacy, but ultimately, whoever falsely accuses me gets punished, and it's it's annoying, but that's it. It's just annoying, isn't it? It's like sending, I don't know, an embarrassing text. And, oh, I wish I wouldn't have done that. That's it. It's like, oh, I wish people hadn't been able to see my body. I was naked. Oh dear. But it's like, it's not the end of the world. And ultimately, apart from that, it's a legitimate crime, in which case, don't commit legitimate crime. How easy is it? It seems like it's so easy. Just so obviously easy to have this. I mean, again, not necessarily, I guess what I'm saying is it's not necessarily like technically easy, but just like in terms of morally justifying this, I don't really see an issue. It's like, okay, literally maybe you could say you have some kind of negatives. I really don't think there are many negatives to this. And then the flip side is you get the huge benefit of no more domestic violence, no more sexual assault. Because it would just be so easy to prove it. How would it happen? But the thing is, this is just the primary benefits. There's also the secondary benefit, which is more money for two reasons. Firstly, because there'd be fewer crimes. Crimes generally have an economic cost, and obviously we shouldn't get obsessed with the economic cost. And in some instances, it's obvious economic costs, like vandalism, and I guess you could say robbery and stuff like that. Murder is an example of where there is an economic cost, but it's kind of like you talk about it as a bit of like a mean thing to talk about. Like obviously somebody lost their life, you're not necessarily focused on the economics too much, but there is an economic cost to it. Literally, it harms the economy when people die. Yeah, pretty clearly, crimes have a negative effect on the economy. So there not being crimes, because why would you commit a crime when you literally know for a fact you're not going to get away with it? That would save huge amounts of money. But of course, the much bigger save in money comes from the huge amounts of cuts that could be made to the criminal justice system. Because think about this for a second, okay? Law enforcement, that can be cut considerably, right? Like, you really don't need anything like as many police in this situation. You need like one guy maybe looking at a security thing, but yeah, you really don't need too much. And then also like detectives, do you really need detectives in this society where literally to prove a crime is just looking at videos to prove it happened? No, not really. And that's of course before getting to the fact that there's not going to be anything like as much crime to detect. When being a detective is so easy because you can just prove a crime super easily, who's actually going to be committing crimes? And this of course leads to the fact that then you have every aspect of like the court system, far fewer lawyers in this society. Like defense, for example, sometimes the state has to pay for defense lawyers. Doesn't have to do it here really because there's going to be far fewer people. Judges, the state doesn't need to have like, basically the civil service in this regard is just so much less substantial because you don't need as many people because there's going to be far fewer crimes, and also proving crimes is going to be far less complicated. And then of course you get to finally prison sizes. Prisons cost money, and I mean it often creates like a lot of ethical issues around, for example, private prisons, because like the more people in prison, it's like, well, should prisons pay for themselves? Oh, let's make prisons for profit. Obviously an issue. Here's the thing though. Think about how small prisons, you could probably just get away with like one prison in the country and it wouldn't be very big, because who's committing crimes in this society? Seriously, like who's just going, like if you're committing a crime at this point, you're basically just saying, I want to go to prison, which I'm not saying is impossible. And maybe there are like the kind of crazy people who literally would just do it because they're crazy. And in that event, okay, yeah, I guess they should, go to like a mental prison or something like that. But reality is, this is not a society where you're just going to have like huge numbers of people in prison, because, I mean, I didn't even mention like the whole drug dealing thing, because I don't really want to get into the discussion of whether or not drug dealing should be illegal. But obviously, I think drug offenses are a big reason why people might be in prison. And in that case, I think you're just going to say, well, they don't commit. And actually, that's another big thing. Drug dealing is a huge drain on the economy. Like, addiction is a big drain on the economy. I guess I'm kind of giving away my actual opinion on like drug dealing as a thing that somebody might do. But yeah, I think drug dealing is very deleterious to the economy. So that's another example of how like you stop this, and just direct effects of it is like, yeah, you're not going to have as many drug addicts in the society. But yeah, obviously the actual people going to prison for dealing drugs, why would you deal drugs when you know you're literally being filmed all the time? It doesn't really make much sense. So ultimately, on many levels, you would save money. And you know what you could do with that money? you could use it to redress the causes of crime, right? Like, again, I'm not saying that a government would definitely do this, but I mean, obviously, one of the contexts here to bear in mind is that I'm saying that in my utopian society, you would have this kind of security camera setup. And of course, in my utopian society, what would the money be saved, be used on? Well, obviously, you know, maybe in kind of more like the pre-utopian society, because obviously in the utopian society, all the causes of crime are already addressed. But in the pre-utopian society, what's that money being used on? Improving society, right? Like, not just punishing people. Like, that's the key thing here. A mass surveillance society is a society that's far less concerned about criminal justice, because you don't have to spend as much money on it. It's not as big of a focus, so you can just improve society generally. Fab. Yeah, you would just save money. You get money. So not only are there now fewer crimes, far fewer instances of human suffering, you now have more money as well. Now, regarding criticisms, I want to talk about like the idea of sort of the balance of power, and kind of keeping the government in check, because doesn't it seem like a big amount of power for the government to have to, you know, like look at people? But here's the thing, okay? First of all, is it a big amount of power to see people in public spaces? Again, like mass surveillance in public spaces, I don't think that's actually a benefit at all to the government. What can the government actually do with that? I don't really know. I can't really imagine anything where it's like the government can see me in a public space and therefore they have power. Power to do what? Like, I don't really think that anything needs to be curtailed there. Now, with the private things, well, sure, okay, you don't want people looking at you in private houses, but again, actually on some level, what would the government gain from that? Especially considering that if it was revealed that the government was actually hacking these, private houses to look into it and look at all this stuff, the repercussions for that would be huge politically. Like, this would be a major political scandal. So ultimately, that's the thing. Like, do they get any immediate benefit from it? No. And that's the major issue, right? Like, if the government was going to do something nefarious with the ability to just watch people, which I don't know how they would actually do anything nefarious with that, but if they were able to do so, it would have to be something which they were able to do while not getting caught at all, because if they did get caught doing this, it would be a major scandal. And this is the other thing, of course, which is, in this society, knowledge of these security cameras would be a major socio-political thing. As I'm already kind of saying, the fact that everyone would know they're being filmed is one of the reasons they wouldn't commit crimes. But it's also one reason why they would be more vigilant about not having a government in charge that's going to be a nasty government, a corrupt government, an authoritarian government. They're going to be more aware of the potential power. To be honest, like, I was about to say the potential power, but I say that. What potential power? I don't really think there's any power to actually being able to see somebody. So I guess they'd be more aware of the facts that, I guess it is kind of power in the sense of like just a generic, like, knowledge is power, knowing what people are doing is power. I don't think it's really much power to actually influence people. Like, again, somebody can watch me cycle round a lake. Or what? Like, what is it? I genuinely, like, here's the thing. I genuinely have no idea what it is that the government, like, people are afraid of mass surveillance. I literally don't know what they're afraid of. It's like, how does the government watching you give them more power? I literally don't know. It's like, okay, the government can watch me do what? That's what I really get confused by. And yeah, it's just very strange to me. But yeah, okay, fine. If even granting, like, to any extent this would be something that people should be concerned about, well, that's just going to make it all the more hard for the government to get away with anything, because people are going to be aware of it and concerned about it. And that's why I do think it is important that people are aware of these cameras, because of course I do think having the government be able to watch people all the time and people don't know they're being watched, I think that is more of an issue. And the main reason I think that is because it could create a situation where, for example, you might engage in a behavior because you don't expect to be punished for it, because there is a reasonable expectation you won't be punished for it, and then the government can use that to just totally, like, destroy you. So, for example, as much as I ragged on people, not obeying the law on these things, well, maybe sure, like knowing that I'm not likely to get in trouble for something, maybe I'd commit one of these crimes at some point. Who knows? But if I did, the point is that I would do so believing that I could get away with it. And therefore, if the government, say, for example, used footage of me doing that as a way to punish me for, something else they didn't like, for example, maybe some of my political opinions or whatever, well, that would be an issue. But if I know I'm being filmed all the time and everyone knows they're being filmed, and it's just like the use of these security cameras is part of the actual criminal justice system, then at that point, I'm obviously not going to commit the crime. So that's kind of my opinion. Like, the issue of security cameras, I think, could only be an issue if they're used to enforce the law unequally. And ultimately, that's kind of my general broad take on, like, government legitimacy and all that. Like, is it equal? Is it fair? Or is it arbitrary? And yeah. But I want to conclude on my main point, the main reason why I'm a massive fan of the idea of mass surveillance. And it's because I think mass surveillance would absolutely destroy any chance of fascism. Fascism would just not be able to get off the ground in a society with extreme, intense mass surveillance. Why? Because it would totally remove crime. And how does fascism come to power? By pointing out problems. Like, fascism is all about observing problems in society. So anything which makes society better, by making it so there's no crime in society, for example, and that you can spend more money on solving other problems in society, that's going to reduce the amount of fascism. Fascism is all about law and order. They're all about kind of militarizing the police force and things like that. And it's like, you can only do that if there's crime, right? Like, that's the thing you can only have if there's crime. Like, you can't militarize the police force or expect to get away with that if there's not large amounts of crime. So if we don't have any crime because there's mass surveillance everywhere, what can fascists do? Like, how can you actually argue for a fascist government, or at least a fascist kind of approach to, the criminal justice system in a society with mass surveillance? You can't. Because in order to make the argument, you have to say, crime is terrible, crime is out of control. That's why we need the fascist government to come in and lay down the law. And it's like, but that you can't do that if crime isn't out of control. Who's voting in a society with no crime? Who's voting for the fascists? Like, what exactly? That's the issue. Like, you've just improved society so much with this mass surveillance thing. Why would anybody vote for the fascists? Now, I do want to touch on the idea of framing people. People might say, oh, you could frame somebody. You could use deepfakes and all that kind of stuff to make it look as if somebody's committed a crime when they haven't. But here's the issue. Firstly, in a society with far less crime, framing somebody becomes infinitely less credible. Because in a society where, like, hardly anybody commits crimes, framing somebody is immediately, like, suspicious. It's like, hold a minute, so you're saying this person committed a crime in a society where almost everybody knows that committing a crime could get them arrested or, guaranteed that they would, get caught. And obviously that doesn't mean you dismiss it, but it means that you could easily be like, okay, let's actually make sure that there is no evidence that something has been doctored here. Because that's the thing. It's not just, say, you want to, I don't know, I'm going to use, let's say, murder. I don't know. You want to frame somebody for murder, for example. It's not just a matter of doctoring the relevant video footage. It's also a matter of that being credible in a world where everybody knows that getting away with murder is almost impossible. Conversely, right now in the world we live in, actually, the idea that somebody would commit a murder is not shocking. Because it's like, well, yeah, sure, they probably believe they get away with it. Like, that's the thing. If I told you somebody committed a murder, you're just like, oh yeah, I guess they thought they'd get away with it and they didn't. If I told you in this world with mass surveillance, oh yeah, somebody went out and just committed a murder right in front of a camera in obvious view, you'd say, oh, okay, that sounds highly unlikely. Did they want to get caught or what? Here's the thing. Other thing I want to stress. I don't think you should ignore how much you would actually have to doctor. Because you wouldn't just have to doctor footage of them doing the crime, you would also have to doctor footage of them walking to the crime from some random point where they actually were. Like, in order to get them to where the crime actually happened, you have to doctor all of that footage. And also you have to doctor them out of any footage they're otherwise in. Because failure to do that at any point would mean that you'd get found out. Now, obviously it's true that if you had large amounts of institutional power, and, there weren't standard checks and balances, well, yeah, sure, you could get away with framing somebody, but you could get away with framing somebody right now just as easily. Like, it's kind of, it's crazy to think how easy it would be for anybody with institutional power to just get your DNA somehow, smear it over a crime scene, and that could alone be enough to convict you, right? Like, basically, if somebody with huge amounts of power decides they want you gone, then here's the thing, like, do they need to frame you? If somebody has huge amounts of institutional power and they want you gone, you're done. That's it. Don't, like, it's kind of like, it's almost naive to act as if, like, a goal of society should be to make it so people with huge amounts of institutional power can't just make people they don't like disappear. No. Ultimately, they can, and there's no way they can't. If you're going to have any kind of institutions with power, then people in those institutions will be able to abuse that power. However, the best way to counter this is by having a strong democratic sensibility, a strong kind of liberal democratic sensibility that basically holds the government to account. And I would argue that a strong democratic liberal sensibility is far more pronounced and intense in a society where there would be no crime. Because the very idea of, like, authoritarianism wouldn't really have much appeal. Like, if you imagine, like, a society with, like, huge amounts of crime, the idea of authoritarianism might sound kind of appealing. But a society with no crime at all, why would anybody, like, a society with mass surveillance where anybody who commits a crime could just easily be found out, what would be the appeal of authoritarianism in that society? It seems like it would just far more entrench everybody's enthusiasm for the institutional, liberal, democratic values. Now, obviously, if a fascist government decided to set up mass surveillance, that would be bad. But that doesn't make mass surveillance in itself bad or fascist. And I would also point out that it's entirely possible that in our current society, with no mass surveillance, a fascist government could come to power and then just set up mass surveillance anyway. At which point, what was the point in not having mass surveillance? Like, if your argument is, we can't have mass surveillance because a fascist government could use it, well, it's like, okay, but a fascist government could use it anyway by just setting it up themselves. Essentially, what you're saying is, if you're saying we can't have mass surveillance because a fascist government could use it, you're basically saying our liberal democratic governments should not have mass surveillance because a fascist government could use them, even though a fascist government could use mass surveillance anyway just by establishing it for themselves. Like, surely mass surveillance, like, it would make sense to use it now where it can actually have some benefits. Like, I don't, that's the thing. It's kind of like, right now it's just, there's crime happening. There is frustration with some of the problems in society. And we're, within that context, whenever there's, like, a lot of problems in society, you could always say there's a potential that fascism would arise. So it's like, I'm just expected to ignore what would solve a lot of problems in society, which is mass surveillance. It would solve a lot of problems of crime and it would free up a lot of money and stuff like that. I'm supposed to ignore that, which could potentially make it more likely that fascism will arise because there'll be more problems in society. So I can then just wait for a fascist government to start mass surveillance anyway. And when they do it, it will be mass surveillance of people so they can make disagreeing with them politically illegal and stuff like that. Rather than, like, that's what I don't get. It's kind of like, if a fascist government wants to do all of this stuff, they can do all of this stuff anyway. I don't, it's like, we can't have a liberal government, and I'm saying liberal just to mean like almost anything that's not fascist. You can't have a liberal government have mass surveillance, not because of what they might do, but because of what some hypothetical future government could do, even if they weren't able to do this, they would probably still do it anyway because they would just set it up themselves. It makes no sense to me as like an argument. And I certainly, the idea of like, oh, if we had mass surveillance, it would make the threat of fascism more scary. It's like, no, fascism as a threat is always scary. And it's like, aside from saving them, I guess, a small amount of effort in terms of infrastructure, so what? Like, I don't get it. Like, fascism is sufficiently scary all on its own. The mass surveillance stuff doesn't really add to, and like, it's ignoring the fact that the main thing that a fascist government would be interested in, and this is actually a pretty substantial point, a pretty good point if I do say so myself, is like intellectual stuff, which mostly you can monitor by monitoring people's internet, which you can do anyway. Like, here's the thing, the fascist government, their ability to watch whether or not you clean up after your dog is irrelevant. Ultimately, there's no way around the fact. I don't think there's a way to make it so that the internet is anything other than highly traceable. Let's be real here. The internet is literally data. It's data that you are, there's just no way that you can expect to not have fascism be a threat. Like, if fascism arises, that's it. The idea of like, well, let's try to make it so if fascism arises, they don't have too much power in terms of surveillance. No, they will already have all the power they need. So like they'll have plenty of power. You won't be able to use your internet or anything like that. Like, I don't know what you're expecting. Ultimately, organizing resistance to fascism is not going to work. And so what's the solution? It's just not to let fascism happen. The idea of like, well, if we're going to have fascism, it needs to not be too bad, so we can't let them have mass surveillance, makes no sense to me. It's like, no, if fascism happens, we're screwed. So let's stop fascism happening. Let's stop fascism in its tracks by reducing many of these societal ills that could cause fascism to emerge, like crime. How are we going to reduce crime? Mass surveillance. Anyway, let's do a conclusion. So I guess first thing I want to say is that I said this was a controversial thing, and I also said it's the kind of thing where if you say it first it sounds bad, and then you think about it for a second, it's not. I firmly believe that. Like, I have no idea what people are even concerned about on this point. To me, it makes no sense. It's like, no, it's just better. I don't really understand the idea that this would be controversial. I don't think any of the objections are particularly legitimate. I literally think the best objection, and it's not even an objection, it's just the best problem, is that we just couldn't have enough mass surveillance. Like, it would be difficult to have the perfect amount of mass surveillance, because the perfect amount of mass surveillance would be total mass surveillance. Every single inch of the world covered, no crime can happen. Like, if you commit a terrorist attack, you just get found immediately. I'm not saying, like, obviously people can still commit crimes where they don't expect to succeed or whatever, or don't expect to get away with it, but ultimately no crimes would be committed by people who expect to get away with it, because they would know they won't get away with it. And even if like somebody on an individual level is able to get away with it, well, I mean, you've still got the fact that as a society, you've just reduced crime so much that you get all of the other benefits as well. And yeah, it's a society with no crime. What's not to like? What's to object to? I don't really get the objections. And I just want to stress, obviously, I don't think this belief is right-wing or authoritarian or anything like that either. I've mentioned before this idea of like, oh, sometimes I have beliefs which could be described as right-wing. I don't consider that one of these beliefs. Like, is not liking litter a right-wing belief? Is not liking murder and sexual assault a right-wing belief? Or is a right-wing belief employing perfectly sensible measures to reduce these things, which also have literally no potential drawbacks? Is that a right-wing belief? Is it a right-wing belief to solve problems with solutions that don't have any negative effects? Because what are the negative effects? Genuinely, like, I would be interested to see a comment explaining exactly how mass surveillance is a bad thing. Because as far as I'm concerned, I say this as somebody who has, again, like, here's the thing, I could point out the fact that I say this as somebody who has controversial opinions. So I could be like, oh, you have controversial opinions. Why? But here's the thing. As far as I'm concerned, that the main issue there is relating to the internet, which is already being surveilled. So it's almost like that's a different thing, but it's not even what I'm talking about. At the end of the day, my controversial opinions have nothing to do with what I go out and do when I go for a walk. It has nothing to do with, what I do in my bedroom with people in, my hypothetical house or anything like that. No, I don't see the issue. I don't really think, like I say, anything I said should be controversial. I mean, you know, at the end of the day, obviously this isn't like some major, like that's the other thing, like even if this might sound controversial, it's not even like some massive like political thing. And to be honest, you know, like in my I mentioned before this idea of it being in my utopian society, I actually began and will probably at some point finish writing a book. Basically, like the premise of the book is that it's set in my utopian society, and it's basically almost like a non-fiction book disguised as a fiction book, because it's like, it's non-fiction that basically the book is just explaining what my perfect society would be like, but it's fiction disguised as fiction because it is actually like about somebody who's, you know, lives in that society, but it's mostly just about actually explaining what the society's like. But the key thing is that literally, like, having written it, in the entire book, there is, I think, a paragraph, and considering how much I'm known to talk about things, there is a paragraph about the fact that everything is constantly under surveillance in the society, because it's just like, sees all this mass surveillance everywhere. Guy says, yep, it's great. Don't have any litter, don't have anything like that, don't have any real crimes, blah, blah, blah. And that's it. Like, then it just moves on, because that's like how non-controversial it is to me. It's like, oh, you have this thing that would obviously stop, you know, all of these crimes, which otherwise can't really, you know, be punished. And it's like, yep, it's good. It means the crimes don't happen. Oh, good. That's, I guess, what should be the purpose. Great stuff. Yeah. Anyway, all right, bye. Wait a minute. Oh, hold on a minute. I think I might have run out of space.